It was a bustling morning at Toronto Pearson International Airport. The usual symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the faint announcements over the intercom filled the air. Among the sea of travelers, Camille Carter moved with purpose. Dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit and carrying a sleek silver briefcase, she exuded an aura of quiet confidence. To the average onlooker, she might have seemed like a business professional heading to another mundane meeting, but Camille's day was about to be anything but ordinary. As she approached the security checkpoint, her calm demeanor was met with a growing sense of unease. She could feel the eyes of the TSA officers following her movements, lingering just a bit too long. Camille was no stranger to this kind of scrutiny. It was the kind of attention that felt heavier than the items in her carry-on. She placed her belongings on the conveyor belt, removed her shoes, and stepped through the scanner. It was routine until it wasn't. A beep from the scanner and a quick exchange of glances between the officers signaled trouble. "Ma'am, we'll need to inspect your luggage," said a stern voice. Camille gave a polite nod, her expression unreadable, as one of the agents motioned her to step aside. Behind her, a growing line of passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. The silver briefcase, now placed on a separate table, drew particular attention. "What's in the case?" the officer asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Camille's calm exterior didn't waver. "Just work documents," she replied evenly, but her response seemed to do little to ease their concerns. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as more officers arrived, their hushed conversations punctuated by occasional glances at Camille. The tension was palpable, and the stares from fellow passengers felt like needles against her skin. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One of the officers walked away briefly, only to return with two uniformed police officers. The sight of them made Camille's stomach tighten, though she kept her composure. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," one of the officers said. His voice was professional, but there was an edge to it that Camille couldn't ignore. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. "We just need to ask you some questions about your belongings," the officer replied, motioning toward the briefcase. The murmurs in the terminal grew louder as Camille was escorted away, the scene playing out like something from a movie. Passengers whispered theories, their imaginations running wild. But the truth was far more complex than anyone could have guessed. Inside a small, windowless room, Camille sat across from the officers, her briefcase placed in the center of the table like an unspoken accusation. "We've had reports of suspicious behavior," one of them began, his words carefully chosen. "You've also been flagged in the system for carrying a potentially restricted item." Camille raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Her silence seemed to unnerve them more than any argument could. Finally, one of the officers reached for the briefcase. "Do you have the key?" he asked. Camille hesitated for the briefest moment before pulling a small key from her pocket and sliding it across the table. What happened next would change everything. As the officer opened the briefcase, his expression shifted from suspicion to confusion, and then something closer to disbelief. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Camille's face remained impassive, but her heart pounded in her chest. What could possibly be inside that silver briefcase? What truth about Camille Carter would leave even the officers questioning everything they thought they knew? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The officer's hands hovered over the open briefcase, his initial confidence replaced by a visible hesitation. Inside was a collection of items that didn't immediately fit any narrative they had expected. A sleek black laptop, several neatly arranged folders with official-looking seals, and what appeared to be a stack of photographs. Everything was organized with precision, almost as if placed intentionally to avoid any misunderstanding. But it wasn't the contents themselves that raised eyebrows, it was what they represented. One of the officers leaned closer, pulling out one of the folders. The embossed seal on its cover glinted under the fluorescent lights, unmistakably bearing the insignia of the Department of Justice. "Care to explain this?" he asked, glancing at Camille, his voice carrying both curiosity and caution. Camille met his gaze evenly. "Those are classified documents for a federal investigation," she said, her voice calm but firm. I have the necessary clearance to carry them." The weight of her words hung in the air, making the room feel even smaller. The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism now laced with a hint of uncertainty. If what she said was true, this wasn't just an ordinary traveler. They had unwittingly stepped into something far beyond their jurisdiction. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're going to need to verify your claim," he said. "Do you have any identification or credentials to back this up?" Camille reached into her jacket pocket and produced a badge, sliding it across the table with deliberate ease. The officer picked it up, studying it carefully. His eyebrows furrowed as he read the details. Special Investigator Camille Carter. The badge was real. There was no question about it. But the tension didn't ease. If anything, it seemed to deepen. Why would someone in her position have been flagged in the system? And why hadn't she disclosed her identity earlier? The officers weren't sure whether to apologize or press further, and Camille wasn't about to make it easy for them. "Why didn't you mention this before?" one of them asked, his tone slightly defensive. Camille folded her hands on the table, her expression unchanging. "I didn't see the need to. I wasn't doing anything wrong. It's not my job to correct your assumptions." Her words struck a nerve, and the officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Camille's calm demeanor only added to the mystery. She wasn't acting like someone caught off guard or guilty of any wrongdoing. Instead, she seemed entirely in control, as if she'd been in situations like this before. The photographs caught the attention of one of the younger officers, who reached for the stack. He flipped through them, his face growing increasingly perplexed. The images showed individuals in various locations: airports, train stations, even city streets. Some appeared candid, others more staged. Each photo had a handwritten note scrawled on the back, but the meaning wasn't immediately clear. "Who are these people?" he asked, holding up one of the photos. Camille's eyes flicked to the image. "That's part of an ongoing investigation," she replied, her tone clipped. "I can't disclose any details." Her response only fueled their curiosity. They weren't used to being the ones kept in the dark. The older officer set the photo back on the table, his frustration evident. "Look, ma'am, we're just trying to do our job here. If you cooperate, this will go a lot faster." Camille's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, though it didn't reach her eyes. "And I'm doing mine," she said. "Believe me, I don't want to be here any longer than necessary." The tension in the room was nearly palpable, but before anyone could say more, there was a knock at the door. A man in a dark suit entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. He carried himself with the kind of authority that needed no introduction, though he flashed his credentials anyway. "Agent Sullivan, Department of Justice," he said, his voice crisp. "Miss Carter is with us. I'll be taking it from here." The officers stepped back, visibly relieved to hand the situation over to someone higher up. Sullivan gave Camille a nod, a subtle gesture that carried an air of familiarity. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone softer than expected. "I'm fine," Camille replied, standing up. Her composed exterior remained intact, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, relief, perhaps, or resolve. As the two of them left the room, the officers were left behind to process what had just happened. One of them spoke up, breaking the silence. "What do you think that was all about?" The older officer shook his head. "Whatever it is, it's way above our pay grade." Meanwhile, Camille and Sullivan walked briskly through the airport, weaving through the crowds. "This is why we don't put everything in one bag," Sullivan muttered under his breath, though there was no real frustration in his voice. Camille shot him a sideways glance. "And this is why we should have briefed airport security in advance," she countered. Sullivan sighed, conceding the point. "Fair enough, but you handled it well, as usual." Camille didn't respond. Her mind was already elsewhere, focused on what lay ahead. The briefcase was now back in her possession, its contents intact. But the encounter had left her unsettled, not because of the officer's questions, but because of what the photos represented. Each face in those images was tied to a web of secrets and connections, and unraveling that web was her responsibility. As they reached a quieter corner of the terminal, Sullivan stopped and lowered his voice. "You know this means they're watching you, right?" Camille nodded, her expression unreadable. Let them watch, she said. It won't change what needs to be done. Sullivan studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's get moving. We're already behind schedule. As they walked toward the gate, Camille's thoughts drifted back to the woman who had called the police on her. She hadn't seen her face clearly, but she could still feel the weight of her gaze. It wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about her, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, those assumptions had nearly derailed something much bigger than either of them. Camille tightened her grip on the briefcase, the cool metal grounding her in the present. There was no time to dwell on what had happened. There was too much at stake. The investigation was far from over, and the answers she sought were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The air was crisp as Camille and Sullivan stepped onto the tarmac, where a private jet awaited. The hum of the engines blended with the distant echoes of the commercial airport behind them. Camille's mind was already piecing together the events of the past few hours, searching for the threads that connected everything. The photos in her briefcase, the sudden scrutiny from airport security, the woman's call, all of it felt like more than coincidence. Inside the jet, the atmosphere was quieter, more insulated from the chaos outside. Sullivan handed Camille a tablet loaded with dossiers. The faces from your briefcase, he said, his tone clipped. We've cross-referenced them with the database. A few of them popped on watch lists, but the connections are thin. Camille scrolled through the files, her brow furrowed. Each face stared back at her with a story untold. Most were ordinary people at first glance, students, travelers, professionals. Yet the patterns were there, subtle but unmistakable. Airport security checks flagged them more often. Their itineraries overlapped in suspicious ways. And then there were the notes on the back of the photos, cryptic but deliberate. She flipped to the next profile, a man with a faint scar running down his cheek, and froze. Jacobs, she murmured. Her tone caught Sullivan's attention. You know him. Camille hesitated. We crossed paths during an investigation 2 years ago. He was a consultant for one of the airlines involved in a discrimination lawsuit. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but he disappeared before the case went to trial. Sullivan leaned back, his expression thoughtful. And now he's showing up here. That's not a coincidence. No, Camille agreed. It's not. As the jet ascended into the dark sky, Camille leaned her head back against the seat, letting her thoughts race. Jacobs had always been a slippery figure, someone who operated just beneath the surface, always one step ahead. If he was involved, this wasn't just about systemic bias. It was something deeper, something orchestrated. Meanwhile, across the city, the woman who had called the police on Camille sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone. She replayed the scene at the airport in her mind, her stomach twisting with a mix of guilt and unease. She hadn't expected things to escalate the way they had. And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that she'd done the right thing. Camille Carter hadn't seemed like just another traveler. There had been an air of authority about her, one that made her both intimidating and enigmatic. The woman reached for a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly. On her coffee table lay a crumpled printout, a photo of Camille, along with a brief description that had been emailed to her anonymously. The email had claimed Camille was a person of interest and urged vigilance. She had thought it was strange at the time, but now the pieces weren't adding up. Who had sent it? And why target Camille specifically? Back on the jet, Camille finally broke the silence. We need to go deeper into Jacob's connections, she said, looking at Sullivan. There's something here we're not seeing yet. Sullivan nodded. I'll pull the files when we land. But you know this won't stay quiet for long. Today's incident at the airport, someone will talk. The media loves a headline. I know, Camille said quietly, but the truth will cut through the noise. As the hours stretched on, Camille sifted through more profiles, searching for anything that might tie the pieces together. A woman's face caught her attention. Young, mid-20s, with striking green eyes. Her name was Ella Brooks, and unlike the others, there was no indication she was under any suspicion. Yet something about her stood out. She's not like the others, Camille said aloud, holding up the tablet for Sullivan to see. Sullivan leaned over, frowning. No flags, no overlapping travel patterns. Why is she in the file? Camille shook her head. I don't know, but if she's here, there's a reason. Maybe Jacobs knows her. When the jet finally landed, Camille wasted no time heading to the makeshift command center her team had set up in a discreet location downtown. The room buzzed with activity, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, conversations in hushed tones. On the wall, a large digital map displayed key locations tied to the investigation, dotted with red and yellow markers. Give me everything we have on Ella Brooks, Camille instructed her team. Within minutes, files began to populate on the central screen. Ella was a graduate student in sociology, specializing in the study of systemic discrimination in public spaces. Her recent work had focused on inequities in air travel, and she had been conducting interviews with passengers and airline employees for her thesis. Her last known location, the same airport where Camille had been detained. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. A graduate student researching bias ends up tangled in this? That's a little too convenient. Camille didn't respond immediately. Her mind was already racing. Was Ella an ally? Or was she being used as a pawn in something larger? The thought unsettled her. As the team dug deeper, a new piece of information emerged. Ella had recently attended a conference where Jacobs was listed as a speaker. A small, exclusive event held at a luxury resort under the pretense of discussing innovations in aviation. The timing was too perfect to ignore. Camille stared at the screen, her resolve hardening. We need to find her, she said. But even as the search for Ella began, Camille couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every move she made seemed to ripple outward, drawing attention in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Somewhere out there, the forces working against her were preparing their next move. The night was darker than usual, the city lights seeming to dim under the weight of what was unfolding. Camille sat at the long table in the dimly lit command center, her eyes scanning every detail on the screen in front of her. Ella Brooks' name was now at the center of everything, linked to flights, events, and faces that had been little more than a blur just hours before. Still, nothing solidified her exact role in all of this. Was she a victim, an unwitting participant, or something else entirely? Camille couldn't tell, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. One of her team members hurried over with a tablet. We've tracked Ella to a safe house just outside the city, he said, lowering his voice instinctively. But we're not the only ones looking for her. Camille's stomach tightened. Who else knows she's there? We intercepted chatter. Looks like private contractors, maybe hired by Jacobs or whoever's pulling the strings. They're moving fast, and they're well equipped. Sullivan joined her side, his face drawn. If they get to her first. They won't, Camille said sharply, cutting him off. She rose, grabbing her coat and signaling to the team. We're going now. The drive to the safe house was tense, the silence in the car broken only by the occasional buzz of updates over the radio. Camille stared out the window, her mind racing. If Ella had answers, she had to be protected. But the forces at play were growing more dangerous by the minute. Every step closer to the truth felt like stepping deeper into a trap, and yet there was no turning back. As they neared the safe house, the quiet tension gave way to chaos. The sound of tires screeching, shouts, and the unmistakable pop of gunfire filled the air. Camille and Sullivan exchanged a look before springing into action. The car hadn't even fully stopped when Camille threw the door open and stepped out, her heart pounding. The safe house was a modest building, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness, but the scene outside was anything but quiet. A black SUV was parked erratically near the entrance, its doors flung open as figures in tactical gear moved toward the house. Camille counted 3 of them, their movements swift and purposeful. Whoever they were, they didn't seem like amateurs. Sullivan grabbed her arm. We stay low, he said, his voice firm. If they spot us. They won't, Camille said, slipping into the shadows. Inside the house, Ella Brooks crouched behind an overturned table, her hands shaking as she clutched her laptop to her chest. She had known she was being watched, but she hadn't expected it to escalate like this. The last few days had been a blur of fear and confusion, starting with strange emails warning her to stop her research. Then there were the men who seemed to follow her everywhere, their eyes cold and unyielding. And now this, a full-blown raid on the one place she thought was safe. Her breathing was ragged as she tried to think of a way out. The laptop in her hands held everything: notes, recordings, even correspondence with Jacobs. She hadn't trusted him completely, but he had offered resources she couldn't refuse. Now, she regretted every interaction, something about the way he spoke, the questions he asked. It had always felt off, but she hadn't wanted to see it. A loud crash snapped her back to the moment. The front door had been breached, and heavy footsteps echoed through the small space. Ella's pulse quickened. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching the laptop tighter, her mind racing for an escape route. Outside, Camille moved closer, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She signaled to Sullivan, who nodded and took a different angle. They needed to time this perfectly. One mistake, and Ella could be lost. The first contractor entered the room where Ella was hiding. He moved slowly, scanning the space with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. Ella's heart felt like it might burst out of her chest as she pressed herself further into the shadows. The man's flashlight swept across the overturned table, then paused, the beam landing just inches from where she was crouched. In a split second, Camille acted. She burst through the side entrance, her voice sharp and commanding. "Step away." The man turned, startled, but he didn't hesitate to raise his weapon. Camille dove behind a cabinet as Sullivan stormed in, covering her. The room erupted into chaos, the tight quarters amplifying every sound. Ella peeked out from her hiding spot, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. She didn't recognize Camille, but something in the woman's demeanor told her she wasn't there to hurt her. "Ella," Camille shouted over the noise. "We're here to help. Stay down." The contractors were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, and within minutes, the room fell silent again. Two of them lay restrained on the floor, while the third had fled into the night. Camille didn't wait to catch her breath. She turned to Ella, her voice firm but calm. "You're safe now," she said, "but we need to leave. Now." Ella hesitated, clutching her laptop tighter. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Someone who's trying to stop this before it gets worse," Camille said. "But I can't do it without you." For a moment, Ella looked like she might refuse. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded and stood, her legs shaky but resolute. Camille led her out of the house, Sullivan covering their retreat. The night felt heavier now, the darkness more oppressive. Camille couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. As they drove away, Ella finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They want what I know," she said. "But it's bigger than me, bigger than any of us." Camille glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Then tell me everything." Ella hesitated, her gaze dropping to the laptop in her lap. "It's not just about bias," she said. "It's about control, control of who gets to move, who gets to belong. And Jacobs, he's just the beginning." The weight of her words settled over them like a shroud. Camille gripped the steering wheel tighter, her resolve hardening. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than she had imagined. And she knew that whatever lay ahead would test them all in ways they weren't prepared for.